I'm a bit embarrassed to come to Princeton and tell people about Bill Miner and Osuyas boy coming. It's a bit presumptuous of me, I know. First of all, just like to recognize we're speaking today on the unceded territory of the Upper Similkameen people, who I have great respect for. This is my opening question. Why is the story of an old train robber still worth examining? Well, I hope that question will be answered as we get more deeply into this. I guess we're all sort of familiar with the basic story. Bill Miner, stagecoach robber, active in California and Colorado in the 1870s, 1880s, spends about, he's a better prison inmate than a train robber. He ends up spending over half his life behind bars, mainly at San Quentin. He gets out of San Quentin for the last time in 1901 and comes to the Northwest, first Washington State, where he attempts to learn how to rob trains, which sort of came along while he was in prison. No, there weren't too many train robbers when he went behind bars. He doesn't do too well, and he ends up skedaddling to Princeton, a nice out-of-the-way place to avoid arrest in Washington State. And you're probably familiar with the fact that he robs a couple of Canadian Pacific trains here in BC, one in 1904, which goes very well, and another in 1906 near Kamloops, and that goes very poorly. And the story is he got about $15 on that one and a bottle of liver pills, and ends up within a couple, within about a month behind bars at the BC Pen. So those are the basic facts that most of us will be familiar with. Whenever I look at this Alex Colville painting, which many of you will be familiar with, I think of Bill Miner coming out of prison in 1901, sort of the lone horse, the old guy. He's not that old, he's about 54, but in those days that was considered old. Encountering a new century, a modern age, the age of rail, electricity, telephones. It's a bit of a shock to him. Why does this guy appeal to us? Well, here's my theory. He's sort of a Don Quixote kind of character. He's really tilting at modern windmills, and not very successfully, but there's something appealing about his character. I think he was known around this town as a kind of a courtly gentleman, even though he was a cattle rustler, a train robber, and a smuggler of Chinese immigrants into the United States, as well as opium. The story tells a lot about how we chose to maintain law and order in those, or what was thought to be law and order, certainly. And I think as the story goes on, you'll see just how involved private enterprise was in law and order in those days. Not only the Pinkerton's detective agency of the Seattle branch, but also, of course, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which exerted considerable influence on the way the law was established in those days. It's Miner's story is an encounter with the cultural dynamics of the time. The struggles of Indigenous people, Asian exclusion, an America that's growing in strength and in industrialization, Canadian identity as it was thought of at the time, kind of confused. Social order challenged. This is the reward poster for after he escaped from the BC pen in about 1907. He's about 60 years of age. It's hard to see this little, I guess this is what Elwyn's given me this. It's hard to see this little snapshot in the corner, but basically these are prison mugshots, and Miner has one, and this one has one size of his head shaved, which was the way the prison officials thought, well, if he escapes, people will recognize there's not too many people around with, yeah. But prison authorities had not very smartly allowed him to grow out his mustache and his hair in an act of what was thought mercy at that time, but proved to be their undoing. He's about 60 years of age at this point, has spent over 30 years in prison. So it's not a great record for a train robber. This, by the way, I should just, I'm going to credit the sources of these images. This one's from the New Westminster Museum and Archives. This poster's on display in their museum.
Who signs the poster, Greg? Who signs the poster?
Who signs the poster?
Yeah, there's a name on the bottom.
Ah. In this case, it is Lieutenant Colonel A.P. Sherwood. And that is, I think that is provincial police, I think. So, of course, we're going through this challenge right now in Surrey, right? RCMP versus, and that was very much alive in these days. His capture was the result not only of the provincial police of the time, but also the Northwest Mounted Police was called in to assist as well as Indigenous trackers who were instrumental in finding him. So there are different people. I'll show you another wanted poster shortly that was issued. But just a sense of, how does prison life condition Miner over 30 years? He's flogged. He's put in isolation in sweat boxes. This is an Oregon boot. It's said that his feet were in pretty bad shape, and you can sort of understand why. This was intended to stop him from. He was a notorious escape artist. This is intended to stop prisoners from escaping. It's basically just a big weight that goes around your boot, and you can imagine the damage that does over time to somebody's feet. So Miner emerges into a new century in 1901 when he's released from San Quentin, the age of so-called progress, railways, electric light, and movies. Now, if any of you have seen the famous BC movie, The Grey Fox, you'll remember one of the interesting things that they did was they actually show Miner at the beginning watching this movie, The Great Train Robbery. And he gets really excited and they start shooting up the theater, which is a great introduction. And in fact, this movie came out in 1903. It was after, about the same time as he was robbing trains in BC. So it was around. I guess the premise that he might have seen the movie is not. It was very popular at the time, and basically helped. It was instructive on how to rob a train, how you got on board, how you worked your way up over the top of the train cars and got to the engine and got the train stopped. So it was. It's kind of a lark to see that. The electric lights are coming. In this area and in the Kootenays, it's interesting to know that hydropower really came to the mining camps of BC before it got to Vancouver and Victoria. They had electric systems, but they weren't hydropower. But it was really in places like Sandon and Nelson in the late 1890s that hydropower got developed, and then came to the Slocan, well, the Sandon and the Slocan, obviously, but the Boundary Country, where they had smelters. This was the industrial, this country, reaching over to the Kootenays was the industrial center of the province, the place where things were happening, and they needed hydropower. So there were, dams at Cascade not too far away, at Boundary Falls near Greenwood. And so this is the famous Kootenay editor, Robert Lowry, who also had a stake in the Similkameen Star at one point, I'm told, anyway, but was more famous for his newspapers in the Kootenays. And this appeared in all the issues. He would change out some things, and one of the things it says over his desk is the electric lights are coming. So everybody's waiting for electricity, right? I mean, when the sun goes down in a lot of these towns in the 1890s, well, go to bed, and or run a coal lamp, obviously. But so the thought of electricity was incredibly exciting. I'm just giving you sort of a sense of the time when Bill Miner was out before we get back to his story. So electric lights, very important. Jim Hill, the chief of the Great Northern Railway, and of course the Similkameen is often referred to as the Jim Hillkameen because Hill in the early 1900s, he got basically he was a very astute railwayman, and I don't know if any of you have seen the movie There Will Be Blood a few years ago about the oil industry, and one of the great lines in that is the rather nasty oil man talks about going in and drilling right beside other people's oil wells, and I drink your milkshake. You remember that line? It's sort of there's sort of a famous, so basically suggesting I steal the work you've done. Well, Hill was very astute in that way too. While other railways like the Northern Pacific and the CPR to some extent and the Union Pacific were building branch lines all over the place, Hill always knew where the money was. So he knew there was gold at Hedley, and he was headed this way. It was Daly, one of the Copper Kings of Butte, that helped develop the Hedley mine, of course, and Daly was a great pal of Jim Hill's, so he knew that he was going to get freight traffic out of there and that he would have a monopoly. So he was racing this way, and also obviously interested in copper at Copper Mountain. But a very astute operator, and he was basically drinking the CPR's milkshake. Canadian Pacific was, obviously further through the Kicking Horse Pass and whatever, but he forced the CPR to build into the interior, the southern interior, through the Crow's Nest and ultimately the Kettle Valley line, because Hill was just faster, more nimble, and so the Great Northern Railway, Grand Forks, 1902, Nighthawk, just near Coston there, 1906, Karamias, 1907, and got into Princeton around 1909. So this country was full of railroad workers building that railway when Miner was here between 1904 and 1906. It wasn't I think it's fair to say it was an American century, the 20th century, under Teddy Roosevelt, the president at the time. But it was still a very violent place. Roosevelt came to power as a vice president because McKinley, the president, was assassinated by anarchists. So you kind of get a sense of that helps you get a sense of the violence of the time. But Roosevelt was considered progressive. He was going after monopolies. He was a trust buster, established national parks, and did other things that were considered generally benign. Among Roosevelt's accomplishments, which apply to the Northwest, he built battleships, and this one came out of Seattle in the early 1900s, actually built by the Moran shipyards, the USS Nebraska. So it shows you the extent of militarization during that period. The rush for spoils is the story of British Columbia and Washington State and Idaho surrounding area. And of course, in 1897, the Klondike gold rush turned things around again. Everybody was looking for another gold rush. The mining industry had been pretty much industrialized in the lower 48, and silver and copper mining, of course, far more intensive, needs a lot of capital investment, and the Klondike was sort of the last shot for the little guy to go and try to make his fortune. Also in this period, they were talking about the San Francisco earthquake plays a fairly large role. This is 1906, April, and miners' last train robbery near Kamloops. One of the major motivations was there was a great relief effort to help the people in San Francisco, and he thought he was intercepting a mail bag from San Francisco that would be loaded with money to help to help the good people of San Francisco. But in fact, the mail bag wasn't on that train. So, but if you look at the headlines around the time of miner, that in 1906, the San Francisco earthquake is a constant headline. Still, I think the greatest loss of life for a natural disaster in California, just if you care, 7.9 magnitude, 3,000 people killed in the subsequent fires, 80 to 90% of the city destroyed, 300,000 homeless. So it needed relief, but Miner thought he could get some of that money. Of course, in that time too, it's important to remember there's a backlash against the Chinese railroad workers who had come in. There's a sort of an anti-Asian movement that starts in the United States with exclusion there. Starting in the 1880s, head tax in British Columbia and Canada that went from about $50 in the 1880s to $100 in 1900 to $300 in 1905. And why is that important? Because Miner was involved in smuggling Chinese immigrants who had paid the head tax in BC, and he was taking another $200 or $300 off them to get them into Washington State where they wanted to be. So the Canadian government also profited too, because they got the $300. They got the $100 or $300 depending on when the people arrived in Canada, and then they were gone to the United States so there were a lot of people taking advantage of that. And this is an interesting story that also sort of just parallel Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, 1903. He's living at Nispelem on the Colville Reservation, and he is invited to speak in Seattle in 1903. The sort of very young Historical Society of the state invites him there. He goes and sees a football game and is sort of shocked by the violence of the football game. And through a translator, he basically, he goes to the football game, I think in the afternoon, and then speaks to the Historical Society in the evening. And through a translator, this is kind of interesting. He says, I feel very well on account of meeting my white friends. I'm glad to meet all the men, all the women, and all the children. I'm glad to be here today. I had lots of pleasure, lots of fun talking about the football game. Today, my heart is way off from here, far away. Today, I would like to be back in my old home in the Wallowa Valley. So he's stuck in Nispelem. He's not really among his own people. He's not among the Nez Perce. All my friends are in the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. My father is buried there. Some of my children are buried there. And he goes on to say, my blood is the same that flows in the veins of the white men. We will all die just the same. But I have one grievance. That is because I am not allowed to go back to my old home. My only hope of my declining years is that I may go home and die among my friends. So Chief Joseph does not succeed in his efforts to get back to the Wallowa Valley. He actually dies at Nispelem a year later. So, that was another big story about the time, which is worth taking into account. It was the age of photography, and among those great artists of photography at the time, Mary Spencer, who is in Kamloops, who was responsible for the famous series of Bill Miner and his accomplices in 1906 that you've all seen. It's in the program, the picture of Bill Miner, but also Shorty Dunn and Louis Colquhoun, who were his accomplices in the 1906 robbery. Mary Spencer really is an outstanding figure as a photojournalist at the time. She actually goes out and meets the party that arrested Miner, takes pictures as they're coming into Kamloops, and then takes pictures in the courtroom, which you don't see nowadays, and all the mugshots, but they're a lot more artistic than most mugshots. And the other guy I think is very interesting in this area, just south of us in Okanagan, Omak area, Frank Matsura, who comes out from Japan and is, there's a let's see if I've got it here. A wonderful book, The Real Old West, that captures his photographs, and they're all at Washington State University as well, online, so you can look at them. But here he is with Susan Tomento, who is Metau Silsk, and that's the beauty of the photographs, is they really capture communities in this area as they were. So, just a reminder, photography is not everybody's friend, and that includes train and stagecoach robbers. And this, of course, is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and his gang. They made a little mistake in about 1900. They had just come off a bank robbery and were in, let me make sure I have this right. They were in Texas, Fort Worth, whooping it up. And they decided to get a nice portrait taken at the best local photography studio, and that ended up being their undoing. That photograph traveled around the United States, and that's why Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ended up in Bolivia, if you remember the movie, because a photograph was deadly for a criminal, and that's why Miner avoided getting his photograph taken. And anybody else who wanted to be in that line of work did too. There was poetry in the mining camps, just a good reminder. It wasn't all rough, but of course Pauline Johnson came out through the mining camps of British Columbia, and I think the miners had to pay $1 to see her. And that was good money because they were only making about $3 a day. The workers were restless, of course, as John can tell you. It was a time of industrial socialism. The miners were poorly paid, dangerous work. Socialism was on the rise, and Bill Miner considered himself a socialist. He was righting the wrongs of the working class. Big Bill Haywood, one of the leaders of the Western Federation of Miners, who represented mine workers through the southern interior, Idaho, Washington State. Big Bill Haywood, it was in about 1905, 1906 that the former governor of Idaho was blown up on over a Christmas weekend, and the Western Federation of Miners were blamed for that. They were also blamed for the killing of a provincial police officer and a retired provincial police officer in Rossland. So just an indicator of it was a violent time. Clarence Darrow got Big Bill Haywood off. It was an incredible courtroom victory, but he ended up being buried in the Kremlin wall. I went to Moscow. So it was a Gilded Age in British Columbia. The mines are booming. The dams are rising on our rivers. The end of salmon fisheries in a lot of places, including, of course, the Enlow Dam on the Similkameen at Oroville. A dam went up. The politicians like Richard McBride were celebrating because the money was flowing in to British Columbia. It's, by one estimate, about $150 million in British investment came into the mining industry in Canada between in the late 1890s and through to about 1912, 1913 when it started to dry up. $150 million basically in bad investment, just lost on mining. McBride ushered in but did usher in an era of prosperity which ended abruptly in 1912 or 1913, just before World War I, when all that money dried up. But during that time, the growth of railroads, the Great Northern Railway coming into this region, the Kettle Valley Line, the Canadian National, the Grand Trunk Pacific, the PGE, so a huge, and all those people helping with campaign funds to support people like McBride. And Bill Miner was headed for Princeton. This is a lovely postcard that Todd, I think Todd tracked down in the SFU postcard collection. It's, I think, a pretty popular image here in Princeton as well. Why was Miner headed for Princeton? Well, in the fall of 1903, this was as good as hideout as any. He'd failed at his first train robbery in Washington State. One of his accomplices had been shot and just about died, and his other accomplice had ratted him out, and so he had to get out of Washington State. He slipped across the border, and Princeton, the railway hadn't arrived here yet. The communication was slow. Word traveled, news traveled by word of mouth. So it was a good place to hide out because it took a long time for people to realize who you really were and to confirm your stories and to turn you in should they suspect you. You can call me George. George Edwards was the name he gave to everybody here locally, and people thought, well, if he says he's George Edwards, he's George Edwards. But in fact, he was Bill Miner, and he he went by many names. I should just mention a few of them. Here are some of his aliases: California Bill, William Morgan, George Morgan, Jim James, George Edwards, William Anderson, George Anderson, John Luck, an unfortunate choice of names for a guy who spent 30 years in prison. He was staying with Jack Budd here in town. Sometimes went by the last name of Budd, claimed to be Budd's brother. Not so. Actually born Ezra Allen Miner, so even the bill was wrong. Born in Michigan in 1846. So, but always claimed he was from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Sometimes said he was born in Canada. So he had a lot of stories. Susan Allison, one of your local pioneers, believed George and invited him to tea one day. And it's said that he came forward, hat in hand, bowing graciously, and said with a distinct southern accent that would reflect somebody from Bowling Green, Kentucky, not Michigan, my name is Edwards, George Edwards. I'm a friend of Jack Budd's. That he was. Jack Budd, of course, was a local rancher here, but he was from the States too, and probably a fugitive from justice. Todd and I were trying to track down a photograph of him yesterday at the museum here, and he didn't really sit for a photograph, and the only photograph we could find was one taken after World War II, where he's an old guy with a white beard like me walking down the Princeton street, but he was smart enough to avoid any photographs that might allow people to track down who he really was. This shows some of the sophistication of Miner. This is when he was still in San Quentin and he was trying to get early release. It shows the beautiful handwriting. His mother was said to be a school teacher, and so he was a very literate guy. But look at it's kind of the beautiful, frilly little signature there, William Miner, and he's got a little. So he could really lay on the charm when he had to. It didn't help him get out of San Quentin early, though. Okay. This is Jake Terry. This is Miner's probably most successful accomplice. They had served in San Quentin together. Terry gets out of San Quentin in 1902, shortly after Miner. They reunite around in the Bellingham, Sumas area. Terry actually is a genius, a very violent man, but a genius. He plans the successful robberies that Miner's involved in, but is absent when Miner fails. So it's sort of an established fact that he probably provides the brains that Miner doesn't. Just the knowledge of trains, telegraph systems. He's able to tap into telegraphs. He's a smuggler. He's the one who sort of masterminds the smuggling of Chinese immigrants into the United States, as well as opium. He's involved in a number of violent domestic disputes, which take him out of action when Miner most needs him to plan train robberies that go wrong. So as mentioned, now this is what I think is, as a kid, rooting through some of the wreckage of Granite Creek nearby, I found this little bottle, which these are sometimes identified as being opium bottles, so that might have been the kind of thing that Miner was involved in. Just a map of the area, you get a sense of just the landscape of the time. So what's important then was this is around this is after World War I that this is put together, but you get a sense of the of the Great Northern Railway snaking its way along the U.S. border up and into British Columbia whenever there's a mine or a smelter to be tapped for revenue. And this actually has the Kettle Valley line in it too. It's after that is built, but it sort of shows you Douglas Lake country. Gives you a sense of what was important in that era. The Kootenays playing a much larger role in the BC economy because of the silver in the Slocan, gold and silver at Rossland, copper at Phoenix, and copper, of course, and gold at Headley, and the copper at Copper Mountain here in Princeton. So this area was very important to the BC economy. Douglas Lake Cattle Company. This is a recent shot of some of the horses on the Douglas Lake Cattle Company. And Miner worked for the Douglas Lake Cattle Company, and that's sort of an important part of his story. And I'll just find a little account. Again, this comes from Nina Williams' book on the Douglas Lake Cattle Company. The book's been, it's out of print now, but she just explains at one point one of the things that happened to George Edwards while he was working on the Douglas Lake Ranch, probably 1905, 1906. One day when George Edwards, a kindly old fellow working for Mr. Greaves, who ran the Douglas Lake Cattle Company in that era, on the home ranch, was taking some Chinese irrigators by two-horse wagon to another part of the ranch. Something scared, I should just mention too, the Chinese railroad workers brought in with them from China just an incredible skill at irrigation from China. And so they were employed, as many of you will know, in this area, irrigating, bringing water to crops and on ranches. And you'll see that through the Washington State too, just an expertise in irrigation. Something scared the young horse of the pair, and the wagon bounced and jolted so much that a workman fell out, fatally hitting his head on a rock. The cook at the home ranch, a brother of the dead irrigator, was furious with George Edwards for being so careless in handling the team and threatened to poison him, as the story goes. Mr. Greaves was so concerned for George Edwards' safety that he let him go. He actually fired him. Edwards returned to his prior haunts around Aspen Grove and Princeton, staying with Jack Budd Rancher. So that gives you a little snapshot of the diverse nature of this area at the time, but the kinds of things that George Edwards didn't talk about much. That wasn't a story that he would tell. This comes from the new Canadian Chinese Museum in Vancouver, Chinese Canadian Museum in Vancouver. This tells you a little bit about the Chinese railway workers who went into ranching. This is Chen Singh, who lived and ran a ranch near Merritt. He was a railroad worker who was out of work in 1885-86 because of the end of the CPR construction, settled in the Nicola Valley, probably worked on the Douglas Lake Cattle Company, ended up buying a ranch near Merritt, and had a family there. So that's the beauty of that new museum. You get some insight into the diversity of the province. Home ranch at Douglas Lake. A few beauty shots I just slipped in here for no reason. This is Similkameen, Tulameen country in the fall when the cottonwoods are there's no more beautiful sight. And this, of course, is the bridge Mark was telling you about, when they were redoing it, taking off the wood siding, the Great Northern Railway Bridge near Karamias. they left scraps behind of the wood that had originally been on the siding. I think it's steel now so that it doesn't rot. But I confess, I did bring some pieces of the bridge back to the CBC, to my desk at CBC. And I just love that bridge. Yes, this is a postcard. This is sort of a typical postcard from the mining regions of BC. It was actually produced in the United States, but this one on the back, it was sent from Rossland in the around the time Miner was in the area. For those who can't read it, look out for us. Don't raise a fuss. We're on the shoot, and we'll make things hum. In all the West, we are the best. Keep up with us, and you're going some. So this is the kind of postcard people would send east to just say what a wild time they were having. And I want to read another bit because Miner like to go to places like Phoenix to whoop it up, to gamble, to have fun with the women who frequented mining camps. And this is Peter Grauer's book, which I think is on sale at the museum, Interred with Their Bones, Bill Miner in Canada. And Grauer, who's gone now, did an incredible job really tracking down all kinds of stories about Miner in British Columbia, including this little bit from the Provincial Police Archives. This is a letter that Miner sent to one of his girlfriends in Phoenix when he was back in Princeton. This is February 22nd, 1906. My dear Edna, he spells it Edner, Edna Moore, who it was her real name. Saturday I received your note, and I think about that time you got a letter from me, as I had written in answer to your letter and had run that party about the house. As I told you, there were 2 girls here. Then, but one of them has gone back to Headley, for there is nothing doing here. February in Princeton in 1906. But I think times will be quite lively in the spring when the men get to working on the railroad, the Great Northern Railroad, which was being constructed from Nighthawk through to Princeton. When you come up here, you want to take this. He actually is trying to lure her to Princeton in February. When you come up here, you want to take the stage at Phoenix for Headley. You will get to Headley the next night, and the next day you come to Princeton to make connections. You will have to leave Phoenix Monday Eve. It's twice as far to come around by Spence's Bridge, so that would, that's the CPR route, and I think it will cost more. The fare from Phoenix to Headley is $17, and from Headley to Princeton, $3 more. It will cost about $25 to get here, but I wouldn't advise you to come until spring. We are quite as snowstorm here today. And then he says, I don't know of any news so good. So goodbye for this time. He doesn't have much punctuation. Write soon to your true friend, George W. Edwards. So it sort of says something about life in Princeton in the wintertime, and that Phoenix was a far more active place. Here's a little shot of, this is why Phoenix is more active than Princeton. It's got 2 railroads. It's got a whole bunch of booming copper mines. There's gambling all night, poker playing, and there's a railroad link to Spokane, which is the real big city in those days. And Miner likes to slip away to Spokane from time to time to live the city life. Okay. So now we're just, how are we doing for time? Okay, all right, I will get going here. We're good. So just to remind you, the miners' train robberies in the Northwest, He's released from prison June 1901 from San Quentin. He robs his first train, the Oregon Railroad near Portland, September 23rd, 1903. That goes very badly. His accomplice is shot, one of the accomplices shot, and he heads for Canada in the fall of 1903. But in 1904, September, he robs the CPR at Mission, and that's a very successful robbery. About $7,000 in gold dust and cash, and $300,000 said to be in bonds and securities, which he's not able to actually get rid of, but he hides it, and the CPR is desperate to get those bonds and securities back, and keeps trying to negotiate through intermediaries to get that, and that ultimately leads to Miner's early release from the BC pen. So May 19, 1906, robs the CPR near Kamloops. With these two accomplices, Shorty Dunn on the right, Louis Colhoun on the left, neither of them very capable robbers. This is a recent shot near Monty Creek, where the robbery took place. It is said that they got away with $15 and a bottle of liver pills. Not very good. Not very good. Jake Terry, Terrible Terry as he was known, was in jail at that time. He couldn't work with Miner to plan a better robbery, so Miner was on his own to think it through and did not think it through very well. They head off into they rob the train in the middle of the night around 11:30 at night, May 8th, 1906. Get nothing, head into the hills. And this is the other reward poster. I just wanted to show you this. So this is somewhat amazing to me because it is dated May 9th, 1906. So literally the next day after the robbery, the Dominion government, the provincial government, and the Canadian Pacific Railway all joined forces to provide a reward of $11,500, which was a good amount of money in those days, for the capture, dead or alive, of 3 robbers who held up the train between Ducks and Kamloops on, they said, on the morning of the 9th, but actually it was around midnight. $1,000 for the capture, dead or alive, of any one of these robbers. The federal government puts up $5,000, the provincial government $1,500, and the CPR a considerable amount too. And so that is signed by order, May 9th, 1906, put out by the Kamloops Standard newspaper. So that's pretty good typesetting, very fast to get that out. The Pinkerton Detective Agency is involved, and you might ask, why isn't there a provincial police force? Aren't there Northwest Mounted Police? Well, David Ricardo Williams did a story on the Pinkertons in Canada a few years back, pretty good writer, and he explains why that is. The provincial police officers, there were quite a few spread through this country, they were responsible for discharging a wide variety of tasks beside policing. They were registrars of marriages, births, and deaths. They issued business and trade licenses and any other licenses required by law, mining and water, for example. And as a consequence, an officer was pretty much restricted to his rural post and ventured further afield only in emergencies. And as a consequence, the provincial police commissioned Pinkertons to do any major investigations. And the Pinkertons had a long experience with Bill Miner. They had all the identifying documents, and they were hot on his trail. So that's why the Pinkertons were quite instrumental in the investigation of Miner here. This is a fabulous shot, another one of Mary Spencer's photographs. And There's a great book on her photography work, A Steady Lens by Cheryl Foster, came out a few years back. And the beauty of this photograph is it includes not only the provincial police that were involved in it, but 4 of the Indigenous trackers. Tracker Ignace in the middle, Tracker LeCamp and Tracker LaRue. And on the far side, Tracker Toma, who's sometimes identified as Tracker Thomas. And the interesting bit about that, let me just find this, is in the actual distribution of the reward money, and this takes them a while to pay out. They don't pay it out until the fall of that year, November, December, and there's a lot of public anger that the CPR was anxious to get Minor arrested, tracked down and arrested, but slow to actually pay out the reward money, and the other governments as well. So the reward money in a letter dated November 29th at the Vancouver Archives indicates that Sergeant Wilson of the Northwest Mounted Police was given $1,350 in reward money. The police took reward money in those days. Sergeant Showbotham, Northwest Mounted Police, also got $1,350. Corporal J.T. Browning got $1,350, as did Corporal James Stewart and Corporal C.R. Peters. Constable Fernie of the Provincial Police made $1,350. Constable Pierce, $800. And the trackers got $700 apiece. And it took them some time to get that money out. So that's it's interesting that letter survived. There's also a letter in the collection that's from a CPR manager back east who says, "Get that money out there. The people are mad at us." So this is close to the arrest scene near the Douglas Lake Cattle Company. The Vancouver media, as well as the Kamloops newspaper, were thrilled with this story. The Vancouver Province actually was issuing extras through the afternoon and evening on some days. This one put out at 5 p.m. Train robbers surrounded. It turned out to be a little bit premature. They had to retract it the next day, but they were getting information from all over the place. Here's Mary Spencer's picture of you can see Minor is wrapped in a blanket. Shorty Dunn, who was shot during the arrest, is there, and Louis Calhoun. They're pretty miserable. It rained that day. There was a forest fire north of the robbery scene at Monty Creek, so they couldn't go north. They had to go south into the Douglas Lake country, and they gave up their horses, so they were on foot. So it was a bad outcome. This is Mary Spencer's picture taken inside the courtroom during the preliminary hearing, and you can see Minor in the prisoner's box, and Dunn is sitting down beside him because he's still recovering from being shot, so he can't really sit in the prisoner's box, and Louis Calhoun's there, and Minor had a very good lawyer, but not a good enough lawyer. He thought he was Clarence Darrow, but he wasn't able to get them off. He tried everything, and the speed of justice in those days, really within about a month, Minor, Calhoun, and Shorty Dunn were on a train to the BC Pen. We wait, 3 or 4 or 5 years to get in front of a court in those days. Literally, they were in court within a few weeks and convicted and imprisoned in about a month. The BC Pen today is a nice residential development. There is a street called Bill Minor Street in the residential development, but the gatehouse is still there. And a year later, Miner escapes. And this is the view down from that gatehouse. So you can see Miner actually has a pretty quick escape route. The train track, that's a SkyTrain line there. The train tracks are just below that. And then you can slip into a boat along the river and get across the Fraser very quickly at, this is New Westminster. And so escape was pretty easy. One more thing before this is something you can research more on your own, but this is something I find fascinating, is in a number of books and also in this article from the Beaver magazine, the predecessor of Canada's history magazine, the Hudson's Bay Company history magazine called The Beaver. This is about 2005. Stories, how did Miner escape so easily from the BC pen? There was a hole that was dug underneath the fence, but people didn't think, he can't get through that. There's no way that, and there were 2 or 3 other prisoners who went with him. So the fairly credible evidence is that he was actually let go, that one of the prison officials actually unlocked the front gates and they just walked through. Well, why would that happen? The CPR wanted those bonds that he took in 1904 at Mission, $300,000 value. They couldn't get any. They couldn't cancel them. They were worth, so that's about $5-6 million in today's. So you can imagine the embarrassment to the CPR having lost $300,000. Miner had buried them somewhere, and during his incarceration at the BC pen, the CPR actually sent his lawyer from Kamloops down with CPR officials to try to negotiate the return of the bonds. And they promised that he would get a pardon in addition, but Miner was the only one that knew where the bonds were buried. Terry had been killed in a domestic dispute around Sumas, so he might have been the only other one who knew where they were buried. Miner, they had to get Miner sprung, and the only way to do that was to arrange an escape. The other 3 convicts who went out, they were arrested immediately. Miner somehow was loose, and the speculation is that he did get the bonds back to the CPR. He didn't get a pardon, but the reward for his recapture from the BC pen was only $500, so they weren't trying too hard to get him back. They wanted him to lead them to the bonds. So that's sort of the interesting twist. It speaks to the way justice was conducted in those days. The CPR had a lot of sway, and if they wanted Miner out, they were probably able to do that in this case. And there was a public inquiry, and the Liberal government of Laurier suppressed the details of that inquiry. So there's good reason to believe that there was a deal done, and that Miner, in exchange, spent another few years at liberty in the United States. So how does it end? Miner runs out of money in about 1910, robs a train in the state of Georgia in 1911, and again doesn't get away and is imprisoned in Georgia and escapes twice. again, but actually gets he escapes into a swamp and ingests a bunch of bad water and dies of poisoning in Georgia in 1913. So really an incredible adventure. So I think the story does tell us something about British Columbia in the early 1900s, about policing, about the diversity of this country, and it's just, to me, it's. I first learned of it when I was about 8 or 9 years old. So, to me, it's just a compelling narrative about that era in our province. So these are two of the books. The book about Mary Spencer, the photographer, Peter Grauer's book on Miner in Canada, the movie about the Grey Fox, which is a brilliant movie, has been remastered and reissued. You can buy it or download it. It's still worth a look. It's a rollicking good movie if you remember it when it was originally released. It plays a lot with the facts, but it's a great story. And I'll leave you with this thought. I think it says a lot about the way we are re-examining our history. History, as we sometimes know it, may not be what happened. It can be just what is remembered and what is forgotten. But the beauty of what's happening, I think, right now, as we get newspapers digitized around the province, as is happening here in Princeton with the Star, and also so that is making information available so quickly online that we couldn't get at before. So we can actually re-examine our interpretation of what happened in 1905 or 1906 or 1940 or what. And the newspapers of the time really tell us things that haven't been easily available. You know, all the searching through microfilm. So that's a wonderful thing. And family stories are also surfacing. People are finding family letters and things like that. So we have a lot more to work with. The story of George Edwards is told in a completely different way than it was even 15 or 20 years ago, and certainly different from what I grew up with. So it's a wonderful time to be involved in storytelling and history. It's a rich opportunity to re-examine our history, rediscover things, and I thank you for listening to me.